Hello, BookTube. As you may know, one of BookTube's biggest events is right on the horizon, and that is Nonfiction November, the brainchild of Olive at a Book Olive, in which we are all encouraged, you more than me, to read more nonfiction, to even the score, since fiction is, and always has been, the most popular kind of reading on and off BookTube. But nonfiction has an infinite variety. It has an infinite wonders. It is every bit happening along the same kind of spectrum as fiction, where you will have very readable examples, very non-readable examples, very boring, very distracted, very incompetent examples, and also great examples. Nonfiction is the same way as fiction, and Nonfiction November is designed to encourage you to explore nonfiction a little more than you already do if you're not typically a reader of nonfiction. And every year, I have people every year when Nonfiction November rolls around. Of course, I read a huge amount of nonfiction all the time. It's my favorite kind of thing to do. Fiction annoys me. I read a lot of it because I professionally have to, but I much prefer the world of nonfiction, much prefer it. And every year, when Nonfiction November starts to move into view, people ask me for recommendations. So I thought I would give you a little TBR, a potential TBR for this coming November, for Nonfiction November. This will be one of a couple of TBRs that I'm going to give you in the upcoming month. And this one involves November releases. Works of nonfiction that are actually being published in November of 2021 that you might want to add to your list. Maybe the way to commemorate Nonfiction November this time is not only to read a work of nonfiction, but also to buy a work of nonfiction published in November. And it's a healthy list because the autumn, the typical, what used to be called autumn in the Northern Hemisphere, late September, October, November, are times when the publishing industry typically gears up and unloads lots of so-called heavy or serious writing onto the book world, figuring that everybody's indoors, everybody's reading more, and also the gift-giving season is coming up. And this is a perfect example to get these things in mind for people. I don't know how much that traditional structure is going to survive the loss of the season of autumn. When it was the one thing that no one was thinking of. People might have thought, well, okay, well, what if people work from home? Then if people start working from home more because of the internet, then, you know, the autumn release season won't be as important. Or people started thinking, all right, well, what if the gift-giving season, what if other gift-giving holidays start increasing in popularity elsewhere in the world, elsewhere in the calendar? Well, then maybe that won't be a factor. The one thing none of us thought is that the season of autumn would disappear. But it is 100 degrees in Boston today in mid-September, so I think we should all start thinking about that. But for the time being, the publishing rhythms are staying true. And the bookstores are going to be flooded with great, interesting nonfiction works. Now, some of these I have already read, and some of them I haven't. But I wanted to give you a long list of November nonfiction releases that look fascinating in one way or another. We're going to start with one we've already seen on this channel. This is by Andrew Pettigrew and Arthur DeWedden, and it is The Library, A Fragile History, with this gorgeous U.S. cover. Extra bonus points to the person who can identify this library on the cover. I have been there. And this is just what the cover says. This is this year's study of what libraries are, what they do, a little bit of their history, a little bit of their imperiled status in the age of the internet and deacquisition. Perfect if you love your library, perfect if you love library history. Those of you who read, for instance, the library book by Susan Orlean a couple of years ago are going to love this thing. Then we're going to move on. 13 Cracks by Alan Lichtman. This is a book about, its descriptive material makes it sound like it's a book about recovering from Trumpism. Trumpism being a willingness to live in an alternate reality despite your own loved ones, your children, your grandchildren, your adult grandchildren, your students in class, your best friends, people you've known for years, saying all of this stuff that you believe, all of this stuff that you talk about now, none of it is real. It's not a different spin or interpretation. None of it is actually real. You are actually living in a fantasy land, and it's putting a real strain on our relationship. That is the basis of Trumpism, and the end result of that living in an alternate reality is that you want to impose it on other people with physical force. It's basically a 21st century American brand of fascism, And this author has written a book on the cracks that it created in the fabric of the American experiment and how to fix them. The assumption of this book is twofold. One, that those cracks can be fixed, and two, that the majority of the country wants them to be fixed. Neither of those assumptions is true, but a lot of the worth of this book will depend on other things. It will depend on how lively a writer this is. So we shall see. This next one is American Comics, A History. This is something I've shown to you before. This is a big narrative history of American comics. It's not to be confused with all of the Marvels, a book I showed you just recently about, in which the author makes the interesting case that Marvel comics are one huge story, the longest story ever told. This is different. This is all American comics. So, Marvel comics, of course, will play a huge role, but so will DC comics, horror comics, romance comics, the comic strips. This is much more of a broader social history of all of that. Still be of deep interest to any comic fan. Unfortunately, it is, if this cover design holds true, then it's the cover design of any book that purports to be a history of comics in America is always going to be the same. It's always going to be a vaguely comic book cover, even with the little box for the old comic book price. Very, very annoying. And also, when you think about it, very condescending. But no one ever seems to design histories of comic books any other way. So I guess we just have to live with it. Then we've got Avenging Pearl Harbor. This is the story of America's war against the Japanese Navy in the Pacific in the immediate wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor, when America had precious little in the way of material to work that vengeance, and did it anyway. Those of you who have read your share of Pearl Harbor histories or Pacific Theater histories, there are plenty of them every year. This will be a big one for 2021. So if, for instance, you know a World War II fan, World War II aficionado, and you're wondering what to get them, this is a perfect candidate. It's one of many, but it looks to me to be one of the most interesting. Then we've got Collapse, the fall of the Soviet Union. And the reason why this cover, that for those of you who were born in the 21st century, you might not know who that is. That's Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union and made the incredible decision to not only extend the olive branch to the West, but to mean it, to start systematically dismantling the ideological underpinnings of his own country in order for it to survive. The full estimate, I know that histories of the Titanic figures of the late 20th century, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, Lech Walesa, all sorts of, you name it. The Nelson Mandela would be another one. There are even political pundits that would rank as these towering figures that just all came together at the end of the 20th century. My argument has always been that in terms of sheer bravery, none of them come close to Gorbachev. And I don't think there's been a historical estimate of him that I think fits with how odd a figure he is in history, in the whole breadth of history. I think you'd have to work really hard to find an analogous figure. And the reason, those of you who maybe didn't know who this face is, you might be wondering why this cover seems so grainy. It's not my iPad. This is a still taken from a TV show. This is what our videos used to look like. They used to be all grainy and very washed out. And that is a signal, I think, that this author is going to look at not only the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also at the coverage of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was watching the whole time with incredible interest. I was watching the whole time. Like I mentioned yesterday, I lived through the Cold War, beginning, middle, and end. And during the middle, we didn't think there was going to be an end. We thought the end would be the annihilation of the human race. There was this nuclear clock, and there was this adversary that we were told was inimical to everything that we believed. It turns out that isn't true. It turns out that wasn't true. The Soviet Union was inimical to a lot about free market capitalism, but they weren't nihilistic. They didn't believe in nothing. And we now have an active political movement in the world that is nihilistic. It is millenarian. It believes in the end of days as signaled by its charismatic prophet. And that power is in control of, is soon going to be in control of the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. Soon going to be in a position to deny women equal rights under the law, to deny gay people an existence under the law, to deny their political opponents a voice, any kind of participation, maybe reprisals. In other words, in the 20th century, when we were looking at the Soviet Union across the Iron Curtain, we didn't know how good we had it, and we now know the whole ambit of that so-called Cold War. We know everything about it now, and this is not a gigantic, fat, systematic history of the Cold War. We saw one of those yesterday. I have a couple of other really good ones on my shelf that I go back to. It's quite a different feeling. Some of you will know this if you're a sufficient vintage. It's quite a different feeling to read a work of history that you lived through. I not only lived through the Cold War, but in certain of its latter stages, I commented on it in print. That is, I was actively involved at the very fringes of it. And then there's Mark Richardson of Richardson Reads. Let's not even talk about his involvement. There was a Soviet Union when he visited the country, and there wasn't one when he left. Some of that is probably classified by several international governments, so we'll leave that be. This is going to be catnip. I love these kinds of books, even if I argue with them, even if I think they get things wrong. And I've noticed, I don't mean to be ageist here, but I've noticed that the histories of the Cold War, or the studies of particular parts of the Cold War, this is about the collapse, there was another one years ago about the fall of the Berlin Wall. I've noticed that books like this that I argue with on factual reasons, where I'm reading and I'm saying, that is wrong. You are not consulting X, Y, or Z, or you would know this is wrong. I've noticed that the books that do that are universally written by people who did not live through this conflict. I don't know what that foretells about future histories of the Cold War. If only the people who were directly involved are getting it right, even this soon after the end. But we shall see. I am, of course, I'm going to grab this, and anyone you know who lived through the fall of the Berlin Wall, anyone you know who lived through nuclear drills in school, anybody that you know that was interested in this kind of period is going to want to read about this. You knew there was going to be a book like this, right? You knew it. Look at that. That's a pterosaur. But it's not like any pterosaur I've ever seen. That's some sort of big skin flap on its head, designed to help with navigation and maybe heat regulation. And look at the colors on that thing. This is a new history of dinosaurs. This is by Michael Benton, who did Dinosaurs Rediscovered, a really good, popular book about dinosaurs. This is a bigger thing from Thames and Hudson, lots and lots of illustrations. It's lots and lots of dinosaur experts theorizing visually on what these things might have looked like. So this book will not be for traditionalists, but there shouldn't be any traditionalists when it comes to studying dinosaurs. You should be interested in changing your views of what things look like. It could be even that the most treasured visual of the dinosaur world, a rampaging T-Rex, is a drastic mistake. It could be that all along we've been looking at the 2-ton equivalent of a plucked chicken, and that no T-Rex ever looked like that. It could very well be. I don't trust it myself when it comes to T-Rexes. I think there are too many fossilized impressions of skin to really support the idea that T-Rexes were fully feathered. But coloration, non-fossilizable things like a flap of skin on the head, fascinating. Can't wait to see. Can't wait to see it. Then we've got Eastern Christianity. This is a reader, and by that you know that this is a big collection of essays on Eastern Christianity, on the Christianity that most American Christians, I was going to say most American Christians don't even know that it exists, and have no idea how doctrinally different it is from Western Christianity. But no offense intended if you are one, but the huge majority of American Christians don't even know that there's a Europe. They don't believe that the world is round. They certainly don't know about Eastern Christianity. They're not the yardstick to use. Most informed, well-read Christians are not well-read on the Eastern version of their church, which is huge, and always has been. I am always up for a collection of new essays that reflect new thinking on any subject. I will always take a big reader or an Oxford Companion or anything like that that assembles some of the more vetted and interesting new takes on subject. Can't wait. Can't wait. Always interested in that sort of thing. Then we have The Education of Corporal John Musgrave, Vietnam and its Aftermath. This is by John Musgrave. And I have a feeling that of all the books that we're going to talk about in this little potential TBR, this one has a chance of so-called popping. This might get widely reviewed. A look at Eastern Christianity is not going to get widely reviewed, but I want to show it to you anyway, because it's coming out in November, and I'm a book geek, and so are you. This may get widely reviewed. This is a new Vietnam memoir, what it was like, all the elements of retrospection. Hi, Bean. How are you doing? talking about books. I know. I always talk about books. Oh, that's all you care about. You don't care about this anymore. It could be that this is, I haven't read it yet, but I want to. It could be that this is a classic addition to the Vietnam memoir subgenre. That would be fantastic. Gets people talking, all the better. I think there's one other book on this list that may pop, but it's not this one. This is the Spirit of a Scholar. This is a new little hardcover, a naked hardcover biography of Erasmus, the Dutch humanist Erasmus. You won't know it from this picture, but some of you who've watched mail hauls in the past on this channel will have seen earlier entries in this particular list of little, modest-length, naked hardcover biographies of historical figures. Hans Holbein had one. Couple. How are you doing? Oh, is that so? There've been a few. There've been, I'd say, unless I've missed quite a few. There've been probably fewer than a dozen in this list, and now they've got to Erasmus. This will not break. They're short. They're anecdotal. This will not break any new ground. It will not contain even a single syllable in it that is new to me. It won't take its place as Leonardo da Vinci. There was another one in that series called With Leonardo. I have a lot of them here. These books are not meant to take their place as the definitive lives of their subjects. Instead, they are meant to be a sort of recension of the facts with a lot of atmospheric writing and plenty of good visuals. That's what this will be. So if you, by any chance, want to read a one-volume biography of Desiderius Erasmus, and you're wondering where to start, well, this is a perfect place to start. So are all the other books in this series. Perfect place to start. Then we have Hidden Mercy by Michael O'Loughlin. This is a book about the AIDS epidemic, but from a viewpoint that is often either not used in AIDS histories or lied about in AIDS histories, which is the role of Catholics in the epidemic. And now those of you who know a little bit about AIDS, but not a lot, are immediately thinking exactly what the media and a lot of rabble-rousing histories have taught you to think, which is that the word Catholic in association with the AIDS epidemic means evil. The Catholic Church was evil, that all the Catholic Church leaders were evil, that all Catholics were evil, that this was a plague brought on homosexuals by their own behavior, that they've got it coming, etc., etc., etc. I'm not denying, but there was a lot of that connected with the AIDS epidemic. But this book is a series of profiles of Catholics in and out of the clergy whose faith compelled them to go to the front lines and help in the AIDS epidemic. And I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to reading it. I think it is, among other things, we'll see how the writing is. That's, of course, the yardstick in any of these things. But I think if the writing is good enough, this may be a very welcome corrective. I'll certainly read it hoping that it is that. Then we have James II and the First Modern Revolution. This is by John Vanderkiste, and it's about poor, luckless Catholic monarch James II. The brother of the Merry Monarch. And the subtitle says the end of absolute monarchy because the James era, the James epoch, is in the weeds historical royal biography, British royal biography, and as such, does not get popular treatments in America. And this is not a popular treatment either. This is fairly scholarly. I don't think this will be in your bookstores. But if you're interested in what James II was trying to do, what he thought was his due, and all the events that surrounded his brother gets all of the notice, his father gets all of the notice, but he was absolutely fascinating in the history of British monarchy. A pivotal figure in the history of British monarchy. It's great to see a title. I don't think this will have wide distribution, but I would love it if, for instance, it gets reviewed in some history journals in America. That would be great. We have something this will get widely reviewed. This is a huge, I think it's 600 or 700 page biography of James Madison, coming out right in what a cynical old friend of mine used to refer to as Founding Fathers season. The minute the trees start to change color on the Northeast, publishers start gearing up their Founding Father books. Lost Founding Fathers, Forgotten Founding Fathers, First Founding Fathers, Famous Founding Fathers, Renegade Founding Fathers, you name it. It seems to be the time when dads and granddads want to get these kinds of books. Sometimes the books themselves can be very cynical. Sometimes the books themselves can try to be burnishing the reputation of men who didn't deserve it. Madison is a fascinating figure. I'm always up for a new book about him, provided it's well done This book will rest heavily on earlier Madison, massive, epic Madison volumes. But the question, again, will not be its antecedents. It will be its performance. How does it execute? Everyone's going to write about this. Everyone's going to review it. I will certainly review it. So I'm going to be involved anyway. I might as well see. I would never miss a big, new, earnest, non-jingoistic biography of a founding father. There are 10 a year about how Washington was, the greatest anti-vaxxer in history or anything like this, where founding fathers are like Churchill, are twisted and warped in order to serve the ideological screed of the zealot who's writing who knows nothing about history. But every year, in every season, but especially in the autumn, there are also major works by non-zealots on these people. This looks like one of those to me, so I will be right there to read it. We have this thing, I've shown you this before. This is Kaibyo. Supernatural Cats of Japan. This is by Zach Davison, who did a book about Yurei, the creepy, well-dwelling ghosts of Japan, the ones you will know in America if you know nothing about Japanese folklore. You'll still know Yurei from their physical appearance because they are the ghosts in The Ring, that fad of Japanese movies and American remakes of Japanese movies where the ghost is very pale and has long, scraggly, wet-looking hair. That is a Yurei. It's not the only kind of Japanese ghost, but it is the kind that was immortalized in The Ring, in Ringu, and Zach Davison wrote a whole book about that kind of ghost, and it was amazingly good. Just tremendous. Of course, he had to include an anecdote about renting an apartment that was really cheap because it was haunted by a Yurei. And he has decided to double down on that and look at Japan's extensive folklore of supernatural cats. Those of you who have been watching this channel for any length of time will know that not only do I play for the other team, but I am the captain of the other team. Nevertheless, this is right up my alley, and when it comes to the Bank of Steve, to authors having credit in the Bank of Steve because of previous works, you couldn't do better than this. Zach Davison, he would have to go a long way to fumbling the ball in order to not have me love a book that he's written. So I will read the book about supernatural cats, and I will probably love it. I will probably recommend it at the end of the year. There's no justice, I tell you. Then we have King and Collector. This is about the art of kingship. This is about Henry VIII, one of the year's major Tudor releases. I showed you 4 other Tudor releases for Tudor-tember, an event that's going on now in September here on BookTube. But there are Tudor-related releases in every season. And this is a fairly big one for November. It's not big enough to really break on the radar of most reviewing venues, I would guess. I would guess that this will attract the attention of maybe a historian for the New York Review of Books or something like that. But this is not the same thing as, for instance, the big Catherine of Aragon biography that I showed you yesterday. That sort of thing does get popular attention. And somewhere down the line, someone will write that big Henry VIII biography that I am waiting for. The one that is both popular and scholarly and that deals with Henry in a fully rounded, no pun intended, way. This is not that. This is just Henry as king. Collector of houses, collector of artwork, collector of wives, collector of courtiers. No idea what the collector refers to. I haven't got the book yet. But of course I will read it. Then we have, this one is The Last King of Poland, who's a figure that I know only by name and from broader European histories like Will Durant. Will and Ariel Durant covered The Last King of Poland in their volume On the Age of Reason Begins or something like that. No, the subject has very little inherent interest for me, but the author I love. I love Adam Zamoyski's work. I think it's fantastic. Whenever he writes about something, I will read it. I think he's one of our best working historians. I don't even append to his name the word popular historian because he mucks around a lot in original archives. I just say he's a great historian. So anything that he writes about, I am going to read. That is the functional definition of an author having totally unsullied credit in the Bank of Steve, is that the next thing they write is the next thing by them I'm going to read. I'm not going to say, if Andy Robbins comes out with a new book on King George III, I'm not going to say, well, I'm not really interested in King George III. I'll wait for your next book. No. Same thing with Adam Zamoyski. He can come out with a gigantic book on Napoleon Bonaparte. I'm still going to read it. Even though I've had it up to here with the pestiferous little Corsican, I will still read that book, and I will read this. I'm sure that I will love it. Then we have Led Zeppelin. This is a biography of the great rock band Led Zeppelin. That collection of young women on the cover, that is Led Zeppelin. As you can tell, I'm not sure if you can make it out from the cover, but this is mostly going to be an 800-page book about smoking. Led Zeppelin as a band was mostly about smoking. Led Zeppelin's critical reception was mostly about smoking. The performances, the many, many health problems of the band members, it was mostly all about smoking, which is why 2 out of the 4 women on the cover are smoking and doing so ostentatiously. Led Zeppelin's story is mostly about that and mostly about crippling drinking. There was along the way a little really good music and a couple of pieces of really great music. And you might guess from that summary that this is another example like the last one, where it's Bob Spitz that's doing it for me here, not Led Zeppelin itself. Led Zeppelin's story has very few interesting anecdotes. It's mostly just self-destruction, garlanded here and there by interesting music. But Bob Spitz can do no wrong. If you have not read his big book on the Beatles, the one that's blurbed on the cover here, you really should. You really, really should. But everything else that he wrote, he's just a fantastic writer. So I will, again, this is another example of the Bank of Steve. I will just read him no matter what. I don't know how much coverage this will get in the mainstream press, the mainstream book press. I don't know how much it will. A lot of book reviewers out there will pitch this to their book editors along the lines that I just said. They won't pitch it by saying that Led Zeppelin is incredibly interesting. Instead, they'll pitch it by saying Bob Spitz has a huge readership, so we should probably cover his new book. I'd be willing to bet that's the approach that most freelance reviewers will take. Maybe it's the right approach. I don't know how much it will yield. I'll be interested to see how much this gets reviewed. Then we move on to Like a Drop of Ink in a Downpour. And this is a memoir set in the Russia of Mikhail Gorbachev. I know nothing about the author. Do I even want to try? Yelena and Galina Lembersky. No idea who they are. Probably ordinary people who lived during the Soviet Union, during the height of the Cold War, only from the other side of the Iron Curtain. I am always up for reading books like this. No idea what to tell you about it, but if you are also really up for reading memoirs of this period, we're seeing more and more of them. The current Russian rulership doesn't seem to care about that sort of thing. Not much. They're perfectly willing to let their people write. Then this next one is another thing that's bound to get a lot of review coverage. This is the final volume in John Richardson's multi-volume biography of Pablo Picasso, The Minotaur Years. This is the last one. At the end of this book, Picasso is dead. There will not be another John Richardson biography volume of Picasso. There will not be. John Richardson started this. He wrote the first book in this series before the Declaration of Independence was signed. Famously, his manuscript of that first volume was destroyed during the War of 1812. And he's just been continuing on. As America has undergone its growing pains, women have gotten the vote, museums have opened to the public library system, public transit system, World War I, then World War II, then the Korean War, then the Vietnam War. He's been steadily working on this series, and now at volume, I think this is 70, he is finally going to finish the life of Pablo Picasso. Despite my hyperbole here, this is a great biography. Multi-volume biographies can often be slogfest, but this is a great example. This is an example of a great, old-fashioned, huge canvas multi-volume biography, multi-volume life. The standard thing in the Victorian era that has slowly gone out of fashion in the 20th century and the 21st century will not do it. This is a grand, grand thing. As anyone I have read all the other volumes, I can't stand Picasso. No talent whatsoever. Pure huckster. Just a pure fraud perpetrated on the art-buying public. And yet, I found these volumes absolutely spellbinding. Just spellbinding. Purely because of Richardson's dedication and his art. This is a towering example of the art of biography. So I imagine it's going to get reviewed a lot. I can't imagine a major literary review journal anywhere in the Western world ignoring this thing. Then we've got this thing. This is by Michael Samuel. This is part of a series. It's Northern Exposure, A Cultural History. And you might think, oh, is it a history of Alaska or the Canadian wilderness? No, it's a story about the show Northern Exposure, an American TV show that was purely wonderful. Those of you who watched it when it was coming out will agree with me. There isn't a single dissenting voice. It was purely wonderful. It was a fantastic run of a show. It had a clear first episode, an episode that kicks the whole thing into motion. It had some clear story arcs that went over years, and it had a clear ending. The final episode of Northern Exposure etched in my heart forever. I'll remember it with almost a tear standing in my eye forever. It was a fantastic TV show, and too few fantastic TV shows get great cultural histories. Too few of them do. I think in some critical circles, TV, especially sitcoms or hourly shows per week, are still viewed as some sort of extremely lowbrow, disposable culture. But it takes a lot of effort by a lot of really creative people to make these things. I would like a book like this about all of those things. I'll take one on Northern Exposure. I don't know that I'll agree with all of the philosophical points that the author makes. I don't know that everybody sees these things differently. The author certainly will have different favorite moments in Northern Exposure than I will. Although it's been my experience and the many thousands of people I've talked to about Northern Exposure that there is no disagreement on the favorite single scene in all 6-7 seasons of Northern Exposure. Northern Exposure sprawled for a long time, many years, many characters, many scenes, and yet in all that time, I have never encountered anyone whose favorite scene from Northern Exposure was not the exact same famous scene. Those of you who know the show will probably be nodding or saying the scene out loud to the camera. If you are saying right now out loud to your TV, dancing on Ruth Ann's grave, you are correct. You are correct. I watched that when it first premiered. I watched that episode. I got all the way to, I thought the episode was great. I got all the way to the end. I saw that sequence and thought, this is the high point of this show, no matter how many years it goes on for. Apparently, there are many thousands of people who were watching at the same time who felt the exact same thing. On that point, Michael Samuel and I will certainly not disagree. But as far as all the rest of the stuff that he loves, I'll be happy to read it. I'll be happy to see how we disagree. And this next one is also an author by, this is Michael Ignatieff. This is his book On Consolation. Finding Solace in Dark Times. So in a way, a COVID book. But COVID had a lot of knock-on hard times as well, things that added from it, that unfolded from it. This has not been an easy 2 years that we have all lived through. I imagine this book is drawing in a large part on that. A lot of times books that start with on, books that are philosophical considerations of X, Y, or Z, a lot of times they work my one good nerve. A lot of times I'm ready to hurl them across the room in very little time, in very few pages. We'll see if that's the case here. I will certainly read it with an open mind. Then we have this. We've seen this before, Our First Civil War by H.W. Brands. This will also get widely reviewed, largely because of how popular the author is, how well-beloved the author is. This is not technically really about a civil war, unless you count the civil war between the colonies and Great Britain. But the emphasis here is not on colonies breaking away from Great Britain. The emphasis in this book, I haven't read it yet, but I gather the emphasis on it is that a huge percentage of the colonists did not want to break away from the British Empire. Taxation without representation be damned. They didn't want to do it. The loyalist population in the colonies was enormous. You don't get that impression when you're hearing elementary school history lessons or when you're reading elementary school textbooks. It often sounds like the Patriots led the American people in breaking away from the British Empire, and that was the way, that was the way it was. That once the Patriots ignited the desire for freedom in the breasts of America, it was all downhill from there for the British Empire, when really the Patriots weren't successful in igniting that fire in a whole lot of Americans. The whomping majority, right to the end, did not want to break away from the British Empire. This will be, I assume, about that. But again, this is a case where the author could write about anything, and I would read it, as this author has never written a book I didn't love. Then we have this thing here. I've shown you this before. This is Pat Shipman's book, Our Oldest Companions. This is about the origin of dogs. Their breakaway from wild canines and their long companionship with humans. Tens of thousands of years living and working in conjunction with humans. How that affected them and how that affected humans. I've sarcastically mentioned that there's only one two-legged creature anywhere on Earth who is actually qualified to write a book like this, and you're looking at him. But I nevertheless have loved books like this in my life many times. I say that in jest. I'm sure that this will be fascinating for me, especially if it includes a lot of more modern research that I'm kept up with. And this next one is another collection. It doesn't call itself that, but it's a collection of essays on Roman Egypt. You can tell by the edited by. That's always the giveaway. And this is a history in multiple, I would guess, it's a history in multiple voices, multiple scholarly voices, writing about all aspects and time periods of Roman Egypt. A fascinating subject that has a lot more to it than just Cleopatra. So sign me up. Roman history just in general? Yes, absolutely. And there are a few examples of Roman history coming out in November that, believe it or not, are not on this list. Not everything in the world is on this list. This is another one. The next one is one that we've seen already, Fernanda Pierier's book, The Rule of Laws. Big, fat study, I think coming out from Basic Books, about this thing that humans have done almost from the beginning, as soon as humans started to congregate. So in other words, as soon as there was agriculture, and even before that, when there were nomadic hunting tribes, there had to be laws. Humans have been accompanied throughout almost all of their time as a civilized species by this huge, intangible concept of law. It's the Romulus and Remus of intangibles of the human race. Law and religion have been with us from the beginning. And this is a huge, ambitious look at what that is and what different forms it's taken. Looks fascinating. Then we have an author I really like, Shashi Tharoor. This is a new book on the struggle for India's soul. Some of you will know if you've been watching this channel, I used to live in India, and I read a lot of books on India. I think the subject is fascinating. It often brings out really good writing in its authors. I will definitely take this. I think this is probably going to be a more contemporary look at the like, for instance, the last 30 years of Indian politics. It might be quite insider baseball, but I've kept up with the last 30 years of Indian politics, so I'm ready for it to do that. No idea if it will get any wider readership. Some of the books on this list have. That book about the history of dogs, you could easily picture the New York Times book review assigning that to somebody. Not me, but somebody. This one, not so much. And then this next one is a big history of the dissolution of the monarchies, of the monasteries, by James Clark. And this is, as the title suggests, this is about Henry VIII and his drive to break the allegiance of the churches in England to Rome, to the see at Rome, and therefore to dissolve the monasteries, pension out all of their inhabitants, take lots of their revenue, take all of their lands. You'll notice in, for instance, 19th century Victorian fiction, how many of the country houses are named priory or an abbey. Well, that's because they were once priories and abbeys until the original inhabitants were dispossessed. Very popular, very luscious fields, wonderful extensive vineyards, great riverfront property, huge buildings. All of that came under Henry's control when he took over the church in England. And this is a new history of that. Who knows what that new reflects? Maybe there's been lots of new thinking on the subject. Can't wait. Anything Tudor related, I can't wait. Then this next book is the one that I mentioned. This is Andrew Roberts' new book on George III, the last king of America. King George III of England, the man who lost the colonies. I haven't read this yet, and I am wondering what form it will take. Andrew Roberts wrote a book a few years ago called Napoleon the Great, in which he argues for 1,000 extremely entertaining pages that we have given Napoleon too little credit for all the good things he did. for all, we won't say that Napoleon did no good things. Napoleon is often the subject of military biographies, but Napoleon the Great talked about what a pioneer he was in every other way. It was mostly, in my opinion, extremely well-written, extremely well-researched sheep dip. And I'm wondering if Andrew Roberts is going to do the same thing here for King George III, saying that what a grand fellow he was, how fantastic he was. If Andrew Roberts is expecting me to like the king who wanted to keep the American colonies in bondage, he's got another thing coming. He's going to be expecting that for a long time without getting what he wants. But I'm not going to miss this. No way. And this is going to get reviewed everywhere. Everywhere. My only stalking worry here is that some book review editors, who have so little space, will try to combine this with the Madison biography in the month of November. They'll say, well, you know, they're kind of the same. I mean, he was the king of the colonies. He was Madison's king until Madison helped the country to break away. Let's review them together. Let's do a double review. It's my stalking worry because both of those books are worth their own reviews. You put them in a combined review, you have the amount of space that the author can do with any of it. It's a temptation. Book review section editors always have that temptation, but I'm hoping they resist. Both of these books deserve full-length reviews. Then we have David Henkin writing a book called The Week, in which he analyzes where our week comes from, our weekday. Where does it come from? It's often jarring when people read into Roman history, for instance, when they're reading about, maybe they read a work of ancient Roman historical fiction. And they realize the Romans didn't have weeks in the way that we do. It feels so permanent a thing that we lose track of the fact that it is not. It is actually an invention. And books like this, they always have the same story to tell. There's no new research on how this happened. But they can be so entertaining, so incredibly entertaining, in a kind of a did you know school of historical writing. So I'm all for it. This next one is a brick. We've seen it before. I have recommended it. I've read it. I loved it. It's The Transcendentalists and Their World by Robert Gross. This will be a big fat look at all. We know a lot of the Transcendentalists by their individual names and some of their individual works. This is about the movement. It's about the people. It's a parade of personalities. An amazing work. If you know somebody who's interested in American Transcendentalism, in that period of American history, or any of the signature works of literature that spun out from the movement, definitely get them this book. Definitely. Then we have Robert Lyman's book, War of Empires. As you can see from the title, this is it's World War I and World War II history, but it's not American. It's the war of Britain and its colonies and colonial adversaries. Could be very good. We'll see. A lot of books on this particular subject, this kind of broad swath of British colonial history, get a little bit stodgy. They get a little bit boring. We'll have to see if this is. I haven't got it yet, so we don't know. And this next one is another example of that. It's by Robert Gowdy, and it's called The War of Jenkins Ear. A war that went on for 10 fairly vicious years that you probably haven't heard about. You think of the Empire of Great Britain versus the Empire of Spain on the open ocean, in the courts of diplomacy, for 10 years. And the War of Jenkins Ear is interesting. I mean, it should be interesting to Americans anyway. But it's interesting to Americans mostly because it, for a very brief moment, had a little toehold in my spiritual homeland of Georgia. This war actually touched the American mainland just a bit, and hasn't had a popular history treatment in forever. I've had to check with Mark Richardson, but I don't remember there being a popular book on this in at least 100 years. So who knows how much original research has been done. Then we have David McKeon. This is Watching Darkness Fall. FDR, his ambassadors to Europe, and including to Germany, and the rise of Adolf Hitler. Some of you saw this in Garden of the Beasts, that book, a very popular book, Garden of the Beasts. What do you do if you are a progressive Western society and you realize that one of your fellow progressive Western societies is being overtaken by an incredibly barbaric dictatorship? What do you do when you're no longer in the era where you would simply invade and take over? You're no longer in the era where, for instance, the British Empire can strangle trade. What do you do if that happens? You've got ambassadors there. You have routine art exchanges. Your symphonies go to their capitals. And all of a sudden, you hear well-substantiated rumors that an entire swath of the population is being put in slave camps. You hear proclamations by an obviously insane national leader screaming on the radio about how he wants to conquer the whole world. What do you do? What do you do if you're faced with that decision? I can read 100 books on that subject, so I will definitely be reading this one. Then we have another book. This is a very popular subject. Unfortunately, it's only going to get more germane as American history unfolds in the 21st century. This is by Dick Lair, and it is White Hot Hate, a story about domestic terrorism in the United States. I don't know if this author will pull his punches in the way that I've read 4 books this year on this subject. All 4 of them pulled their punches to one extent or another about domestic terrorism. These are Trump supporters. All of them are. And they are because they're encouraged to be that by Trumpism and by Trump himself directly in statements and implications and written comments that should already have had him arrested. It isn't just aggrieved, lower-class, economically white domestic terrorism. It's Trump terrorism. And I don't know if this book will pull punches. I don't know if it will use all the euphemisms like that. I have no idea. I don't know why such books do. I know that for 30 years in New York, Donald Trump had a reputation as being incredibly litigious, that if you so much as came anywhere near his name, he would drag you through the court. His cases wouldn't have any merit any more than any of the cases he's brought before courts in the last 5 years have had any merit, but they were designed to crush you economically. They were designed to bankrupt you. They were designed to use the court system in New York as a bludgeon to silence opposition, to silence criticism. He had a reputation for that. He's a public figure now. I have no idea. He doesn't have that kind of a threat anymore. I don't know why authors would be worried about that. And I can't think of any other reason why they would pull their punches and use euphemisms unless they're physically afraid of their neighbors. Either way, I will read this book. It will either be an insightful commentary or it will be completely useless. If you don't call this thing by what it is, then your book is useless. So we shall see. I will report back. Then I believe this is the last one on our list here. This is a book we've already seen. It's by a great biographer, Claire Tomlin, whose credit in the Bank of Steve is so enormous that she could write anything. She's a great biographer. And her new book is about H.G. Wells. We saw it, but it wasn't called this when we saw it, I think. It's been rebranded Young H.G. Wells. And it's about young H.G. Wells. It's not about the legendary figure later in his life. It's about the young man writing, hustling, earning a living with his pen, thinking about changing the world, but not actually in a position to do it yet. I believe this volume, I have it, but I haven't started it yet. I believe it leaves off right at the doorstep of Wells's world fame as a writer. I think that it does. I think it concentrates mostly on Wells as a young radical thinker and writer. We shall see. Like I said, I think Wells is a fascinating story. I'm amazed that he doesn't have 5 big, fat, 1,000-page biographies. I'm amazed that we don't get one of those every other year. Considering his name recognition as an author, I'm amazed that we don't. This is not that. This is not a large book, and it's not about the whole of Wells's life, but I'll take it. Not only because I think Wells is fascinating, but also because I'll read anything that Claire Tomlin writes. I believe, yes, right. Believe it or not, that is the end. So I'm no longer obstructing your view of the cutest dog on BookTube. But that is a, believe it or not, non-exhaustive sampling of the nonfiction works that are coming out this November in time for Nonfiction November. So if any of those books struck you as of interest, or all of them did, feel free to pre-order them all so that you have something non-fiction-y to read during Nonfiction November. Very tasty stuff. A lot of this stuff looks very tasty. Don't you want to read about the dissolution of the monasteries? Don't you want to read about the newest research in the Eastern Christianity or dinosaurs? A new book about the young H.G. Wells, before he was the Poobah who had written 6 famous books that everybody knows. It's all fascinating. And it's all coming out in November, and it's not even the whole of it. I could have doubled the size of this. I could have tripled it. But the next Nonfiction November TBR buster that I'm going to do is not going to be releases coming out in November. I realize that's largely my bailiwick. Olive made a video the other day on her channel where she talked about the fact that when you are a reviewer, a lot of you know this already from watching this channel. A lot of your viewpoint starts to shift to books that aren't out yet. It just becomes it's a hazard of the job. But the next TBR that I want to make for November is a TBR of nonfiction that's already out that you might want to consider. Because why can't I bombard you with book titles? What's BookTube for if I can't bombard you with book titles? So you can expect that sometime later, maybe in October. But in the meantime, I'm going to wrap this up before we hit the hour mark. But I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.